Good morning. Let's get straight to markets.
Take a look at the impact for the indices.
Factual. Succinct. All you need to know before your trading day starts. Subscribe to our newsletter, CNBC's Daily Open.
Welcome to Beyond the Valley, a CNBC tech podcast with Arjun Kharpal and Tom Chitty.
Beyond the Valley.
Last week's IT failure may go down as the worst in history. Computers around the world began to grind to a halt on Thursday night after a faulty software update with a single defect saw severe disruption to air travel, hospitals, banks, and much more. This week, we're going to explain how this happened and the subsequent fallout. We'll also hear Arjun's first-hand account of his day at CNBC's London offices and how CNBC managed to get on air. And finally, what does this failure tell us about the vulnerable foundations on which today's economy is built, and how can we make it stronger?
Beyond the Valley.
We had a quick chat on Friday, lunchtime, last week, where you said, I think, the words were, "I've never known a day like it." So just to give our listeners an idea, kind of how did the day start?
As you mentioned, like a day, unlike I've never experienced before in my career here as a reporter, as a journalist. And I was scheduled to sort of get in and talk about Netflix earnings. And what had happened was overnight, firstly, we had heard about issues with Microsoft cloud servers. But before we were scheduled to go on air, people's sort of computers started to crash, and there were questions over whether we would get onto air or not. Anyways, it was all fine in the first hour of Squawk Box, our morning show, and I spoke about Netflix. And after I'd come off air, sort of nearer to sort of 7 a.m. London time, I noticed that my computer had crashed and others too. And
so a secondary sort of crash.
This was the first time mine had kind of crashed. I think others had earlier on, but it wasn't as widespread at that point. Anyways, these computers started then falling like dominoes at this point, and the blue screen of death, as it's called, was appearing. But at this point, we didn't really know what was causing it. And I was sort of frantically running around the office trying to figure out what had happened at this point.
Because you're in that unique position where you're being affected by this problem, but you've also got to cover this problem as a journalist that covers tech. So you are the news.
That's it. So, I mean, how we broke this story, and we were actually one of the first in the world to break this story, and you're going to talk about it, but it came from an update issued by a company called Crowdstrike, which we're going to get into. But the way we found that out, interestingly, was the fact that because it was affecting us, our IT departments globally had been speaking to Crowdstrike support. And, you know, we had got confirmation then from the company via our colleagues at NBC that this was indeed the reason for this global IT meltdown. And, you know, from that moment, I think I ran on air, reported this news on CNBC.com. We got a headline out and the bare bones of information, which was, you know, very limited at the time we knew. And from then on, the story snowballed.
We're going to talk more about it, kind of who Crowdstrike are. I think, you know, some people would probably never have heard of Crowdstrike. But before we do that, for our listeners, if you haven't already, you can subscribe to the Beyond the Valley weekly newsletter. Head to cnbc.com/Beyond the Valley, click on the subscribe button, and you'll get a newsletter every Friday with all the best international tech stories from CNBC, including all the events of last week. And if you want to contact Arjun and I or have a question about a past episode, then email us at beyondthevalley@cnbc.com. I know this is a sort of crowbarred episode because of what happened at the end of last week, but do you have a stat of the week?
I do.
Oh, we do? Oh,
yeah.
Look at you, just on top of it.
$1 billion.
$1 billion. Okay, great. Just really, you know, specific, but that works for me. I'll see what I can do with that. Weird to just do it on my own, considering last few episodes I've been competing against someone far more intelligent than myself. So let's see how I go. Okay, let's get into the bones of it. Crowdstrike. Who are Crowdstrike?
So Crowdstrike are a cybersecurity company, effectively, and they US-based cybersecurity company that sells cybersecurity software aimed at businesses. At the core, that's effectively what they do.
And their owner is a billionaire, George Kurtz, and the company is worth billions of dollars. So this isn't just some small, firm. This is a firm that supports the security of Microsoft
and the security of organizations across the world. That's the more important part of the equation, is that it's not a small firm. Lots and lots and lots of global businesses rely on CrowdStrike for their security, and that's why this whole episode was quite a big ordeal, and why it was so widespread.
There was also something that happened before the CrowdStrike thing, right? Related to Microsoft's cloud.
So the timeline's quite important, I think. So I got into the office Friday morning, London time, overnight our time, so late US. Microsoft had issued an update saying that their Azure cloud services were facing some problems, and that there could be disruption to certain Microsoft cloud-based apps, like Teams, for example.
So is that what you were talking about when you had your first kind of update that you needed to do?
So that was the first thing.
Right. But when you first came into the office.
What we found out later was that was completely, wholly unrelated to what followed with CrowdStrike.
Which then probably confused countless of IT managers, engineers, when this was happening, because they're probably thinking, oh, it must be related to the update we did earlier, right?
Yeah, that's right. So they there were questions over whether this was a Microsoft. I had first seen that and thought it was a Microsoft issue, the reason why Windows crashed on my PC. But then as we started to get more information, we found out it was to do with CrowdStrike. And the specific issue was this. CrowdStrike software called Falcon. This is what they call an endpoint monitoring product. So it's effectively a piece of software designed to protect what they call endpoints. It's a jargony term in the cybersecurity industry. Basically means your laptop, means your PC, means smartphone, means something. Right. An end device.
Is it so the recipient at the end of the line in the process of creating?
It's that device at the end of the line. So it's designed to protect PCs, laptops, etc. Now, what CrowdStrike did was, and this is normal for cybersecurity firms, is they have to issue updates very often because the cybersecurity landscape and the threats are constantly changing. The different ways hackers might attempt to exploit vulnerabilities in machines, etc. So they have to update regularly the patches and the defense against these kind of new vectors of attack. And therefore, a mundane update they issued, which was to roll out across their customers globally, is what they did. Now, these are, if you've got a smartphone, your smartphone sometimes automatically updates overnight, right? Or it will automatically download apps. This is very similar to what happened there. It was almost an automatic scheduled update that was due to come in. The problem was the fact that the company CrowdStrike has to constantly update its offering is also where the weakness stems from. And they issued an update that had buggy code in it, effectively defective code. And in order to this cybersecurity software are quite special because they're trying to protect an organization's entire infrastructure. They need deep access into the
kernel.
The kernel.
The kernel.
Yeah, the core.
The core.
The heart,
yeah.
effectively, of an organization's IT infrastructure. And so then they need that in order to detect if anything bad is happening inside an organization. But by doing so, if things go wrong, it can take down a system. So they've issued this buggy piece of update, and that's effectively crashed Windows. So it wasn't a Windows or Microsoft issue. It was a CrowdStrike issue. And as a result, people began to see the so-called blue screen of death, which popped up on their PCs and laptops. And you would have seen an unhappy face on those error messages as well.
So were they updating on their own without you having to click on the update Was it just happening in the background?
Yeah, effectively it was, but it wouldn't be something you as a PC user in CNBC would have seen. Yeah, you wouldn't have to click update now or something like that. That would have been at the IT department level kind of update,
because they could have set flag don't update. But it was already happening.
It was already in progress, and so that led to a ton of crashes, and actually, what a morning it was here at CNBC. I just to go back to that story, I've never experienced anything like it. There were questions over whether we would get to air. We did.
A UK broadcaster, Sky News, didn't get to air. So along with countless others, I know CNBC didn't get to air, and some Australian networks as well, I believe.
Yeah, and by the time there were computers offline. We were using our phones to get all the information. So it was a crazy morning. I was sat on set about 7:45, I think, doing a hit on. I can't even remember what it was. I feel like we were talking. At this point, we didn't know a lot of information. So it was kind of like we had some reports, we had some information, this is what we know. But I was also talking about the Apple Vision Pro at the time, which is something I tried out last week for the first time. We'll talk about that later. But, and then all of a sudden, the producers at 7:45 a.m. said, stay on set, don't go anywhere. And from that moment, I did not leave that set for about 3.5, 4 hours. I was constantly on air, update after update, minute after minute, as new things came through. We heard of airlines, systems not working, huge delays at airports across the world, people not being able to check into flights, various different industries, banking industry, retail, all affected by this huge sort of wipeout of global IT at this point in time. And even to the point where our first US show, Worldwide Exchange, we were almost every 5 minutes popping up on that to give an update. And it was a crazy one. And the way the teams handled it here was incredible globally. Our producer and everything. It was just an extraordinary morning.
I imagine the US team were probably thinking or asking lots of questions about what's been going on, or at least try and rectify the situation that was happening with their systems.
Yeah, well, with us, it was the fact we'd been online for several hours already, right? And so we had been following this story, second by second. And so they were asking a lot of questions of us about what had happened, what had been said, what had gone wrong. And so, we were able to provide those kind of updates. But it was a really extraordinary day.
One question I have about the update, and how I know you mentioned that they're making lots of updates all the time to stay ahead of any bad malware, but wouldn't they be testing this update before they go and send it out to 8.5 million Microsoft devices? Yeah,
you'd think so. And I'm sure, look, testing I'm sure had been done. I have no doubt about that. But there was obviously a chink in the armor along the way. And so that's the issue, is how do you make that process more resilient? And these are all the questions, I think, debates happening now about the fragility of global IT systems, and particularly in this, where, that update should have been robustly tested. And also, does it make sense to, roll this out globally in one go? Should you sort of phase it almost out in order to, if you did a first phase of rollout, you would know then if there was an issue.
Like a pilot episode of a TV series to see what the reaction is. Is it positive?
Is it, or has it crashed, people's computers? And that's kind of what could have been done, I think.
Yeah. I mean, when we talk about the kind of fallout financially, we'll talk about the lessons learned, I think, but the fallout financially, I think, hard to gauge exactly the cost, but multi-billion-dollar mistake, essentially. CrowdStrike, just to be clear, has admitted responsibility for the faulty software update. And I think the share price has sort of mirrored that, in the sense that Microsoft hasn't budged and CrowdStrike plummeted. I suppose the question then is, CrowdStrike probably going to be the ones footing the bill, but that whole process could take years to fall out. And I know there's lots of air passengers that aren't going to get refunded for or compensated for their missed flights or their cancelled flights. So I don't know. It's so pervasive, isn't it, in terms of how it's affected so many industries.
So many industries and so many. It's not like a niche business problem. Well, it's something that most people traveling on an airline wouldn't even sort of think about. Oh, will my airline's IT systems be okay? But that's what's happened. It's just affected. And also, I was walking past a retailer in London, a men's retailer, on Friday. And, they'd handwritten a note on their door saying, sorry, we're closed because our IT systems don't work. And that was just one case. You can imagine across the board how much money those... And so there's a few things. It's, you mentioned the airline passengers. And if they're not getting refunds from their airlines because of this issue, they're unhappy. But the airlines have probably been cost millions of dollars as well.
I mean, just to be clear, airlines are still having to cover costs of hotels, food, any additional costs that they might have, whatever, as related to the cancelled or delayed flight.
And various taxes or whatever else.
It's just that they're not compensating the value. And this is UK, this is, the Civil Aviation Authority's advice, but that they're not essentially giving them a whole lump of cash because it was out of their hands. It wasn't the issue, that they didn't cause the issue, essentially.
But you could imagine a lot of businesses as well who've lost money directly as a result of this issue may even be thinking about legal action against CrowdStrike.
Yeah.
Saying, well, it's your issue that cost us this amount of money, so you should pay. So there could be a ton of fallout for years to come from this. On CrowdStrike specifically, one from the stock price reaction, two from the reputational damage here, and any kind of potential legal action. But it is also legally a grey area, I think. How do you... there's regulation, for example, around companies in Europe, in the US, in the UK, around how companies, if they're the victim of a data breach or a hack, they need to disclose that if it's material enough to the regulators and to their customers. Obviously, this wasn't a hack, quite clearly, and this wasn't a cybersecurity incident. So what do you do in this situation? That's the big question.
Yeah. I mean, to give a few other stats, 2,500 flights were cancelled globally, and in the UK, Friday was forecast to be the busiest day for departures since October 2019.
Wow.
Yeah.
Because of the school holidays starting very soon?
Correct. Which I thought was pretty bad timing. Let's talk a little bit about which countries weren't affected necessarily, because there were some, including China and Russia, that weren't. But I know you want to speak a little bit about China.
China is an interesting case because if you think about it, yes, Windows is actually used in China, but the issue again wasn't a Windows issue, it was CrowdStrike. But Chinese companies are not using an American cybersecurity firm for their cybersecurity, clearly not. And so they wouldn't have been affected by it. Others might have even been using a completely different operating system as well. But that's why China wasn't effective. I think it underscores the bifurcation of apps and operating systems and software that's happening, and we continue to see between the US and China as well. But that's why China wasn't effective. And what about Russia?
Yeah, well, the irony is that obviously Russia avoided the chaos because Western sanctions mean that they don't use software that's owned by Western companies such as Microsoft and CrowdStrike. So they're becoming increasingly self-sufficient using companies such as Kaspersky, which is based in Moscow, for their antivirus needs. So they avoided all of it.
Subscribe to the Squawkbox Europe Express podcast. Join Steve, Karen, and myself, Arabile, in unscripted and dynamic debate around the day's top stories with first and exclusive interviews of the best in business and global newsmakers, original points of view, and instant analysis of the latest business news and key market themes. Get set for the day ahead. Squawkbox Europe Express podcast, now available on Spotify, Apple Music, and Google Podcasts.
This wasn't a hack or a cybersecurity breach, but it has been reported that hackers were trying to take advantage of what happened. What was going on there?
Yeah, and it was quite, rudimentary in many ways. It wasn't like they were trying to exploit the technical sort of vulnerabilities at all. It was more that, they were trying to impersonate Crowdstrike support or Microsoft support, saying, hey, click this link and we'll solve your IT issues, etc., etc. So it was more that kind of thing. And it's something you see with major incidents across the world, no matter what it is. If there's a need to interact with a company, you see sort of text messages, emails, etc., of hackers trying to impersonate others. They call it phishing, PH, phishing. Yeah. PH phishing. But they call it a phishing attempt, and so they often accompany with a link that's malicious and will effectively steal your data if you click it. So don't do that.
So just you've been warned. Okay, so I suppose when we talk about we've talked about the cost, but lessons learned from what's happened. Are there any, and what could be done? I know that in April, the Cyber Safety Review Board, which is part of the US Homeland Security Department, issued a pretty scathing report into Microsoft's failed safety culture. This was off the back of a Chinese hack that affected UK and US personnel following a summit that they had, the two countries had. So there has been already some concerns around Microsoft safety protocols, but this doesn't feel like necessarily their issue.
No, I think the biggest lesson everyone has learned is how fragile the global IT system is. I think how much the concentration of power is in individual companies and their software, and how businesses rely on very few vendors. And that creates a huge amount of risk in the global system when it comes to IT.
But should there be more? Should there be more regulation to break up, what looks like a monopoly?
Well, that's a whole nother, I think, discussion. The issue here is that, there are companies that are offering services. If you take a Microsoft, if you take Amazon, they're not just offering you one service. They're offering you the cloud and Teams and everything else. And so, that becomes attractive for businesses. There is that question about should all this kind of offers and bundling of services be banned. But right now for businesses, they'd rather say, well, I'll pay you one thing and you sort out everything. It's more convenient, right? So the question is, does this spur businesses at all to think about the way that their technology stack is built up and say, you know what, maybe we need a couple of different providers for this kind of cybersecurity? And actually the question is also how easy that is. It's not easy. But I think it will spur a bit of thinking about how businesses rely on, effectively one or two companies. If there's a failure at any point, that could bring down a whole organization, as we've seen.
Yeah, and also have plans in place to counter an outage from a third party, because it looks like there wasn't necessarily, or not enough planning was done to counter what essentially was a very small defect in the code that has brought the globe to a standstill in many respects.
And one of the most interesting things is over the past few years and even now, there's all this talk about the move to the cloud, right? The move to, hosting your business and data, etc., on servers owned by Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and others, right? But again, you are necessarily handing power over to those companies and control that if things go wrong, you might not have the ability to do backups and control all of that data. So there's also a vein of thinking that, right, whilst a lot of stuff does need to move to the cloud and it gives you many advantages in terms of cost savings and nimbleness and access to new AI applications, etc., there's a view now that perhaps actually businesses need to keep some of that data on premise, i.e. on servers in their office somewhere or nearby. And that's an interesting thought because, a few years ago it was more, let's just digitize everything and move it all to the cloud. So, we'll see if that trend plays out and actually what kind of long-lasting effect this has on companies like CrowdStrike. But, the big question is, can IT departments figure out how to diversify a business's IT supply chain effectively?
So, final question, will this happen again?
Probably, because as long as this fragility exists and there's a lack of regulation, the, I guess, atmosphere is ripe for something like this. The concentration of power remains in very few companies' hands that run businesses. I'll just read you a quote actually from the former chief executives of the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre, Professor Ciaran Martin, who basically said, this was to Sky News, he said, "The worst of this is over because the nature of this crisis was such that it went very badly wrong very quickly. It was spotted quite quickly and essentially it was turned off. Until governments and the industry get together and work out how to design out some of these flaws, I'm afraid we are likely to see more of these again. Within countries like the UK and elsewhere in Europe, you can try and build up that national resilience to cope with this, but ultimately, a lot of this is going to be determined in the US." Again, they're hinting at the fact that so many of these companies, CrowdStrike, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, are American firms. And so, yeah, the likelihood of this happening again is quite high.
Well, sobering thoughts. But on that note, let's do stat of the week to lift everyone's mood.
$1 billion?
The value CrowdStrike lost since Friday.
No, it wasn't. It's quite an obvious one. Shall I give you a second guess?
The amount it's expected to cost companies.
Yeah?
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 It was one or the other.
Yeah.
It was one or the other.
It's effectively, it's a very early estimate, and it's probably likely more than this, but it's the amount, the economic impact, amount it's cost businesses, this IT outage. That's according to Patrick Anderson, the CEO of Anderson Economic Group, which is a Michigan research firm that specializes in estimating the economic costs of events like strikes and other business disruptions, and that stat has come via CNN.
Fantastic. All right, that's it for this week. Before we go, please follow and subscribe to the show, and you can leave us a review if you'd like. And thank you, Arjun.
Thank you, Tom.
We'll be back next week for another episode of Beyond the Valley. Goodbye.
Beyond the Valley.